I was just watching a documentary about a gun, and they interview a SEAL, and he said, the real quantum leap for the teams in Vietnam came when they started to embed a Navy intelligence officer at our FOB. And we'd come back from a raid, and he'd be like, next time, bring me back whatever all the dead guys had in their pockets. And the next time you bring back all the stuff the guys had in their pockets. And then like a week later, the evidence from that, without leaving the FOB, generates, through communications and other analysis, it generates another raid, generates a follow-on raid. And he's like, all of a sudden you had, more work than you knew what to do with, and you're working your way through a chain of events, right? You're generating like a coherent mission set that centers around the first node or first point of contact. It's like an investigation. And by the time of the nascent expeditionary targeting force era in the mid-2000s in Iraq, and this is what really fuels the special operations activity during the surge, things came out initially, this before Relentless Strike was published. There were some, these like heartstring tugging pieces on local news where these operators from Development Group were from, where they died. And one of them in particular set a lot of guys' tongues wagging. They thought it was impossible. It was a screen capture of a letter that one of them had written his idol. This guy was like some kind of commando or veteran who had prepared this erstwhile young man who was probably in his 30s when he died to enter the military out of high school. And the letter said, and it had a flag. It was a folded up flag in a bag. It had a letter on top of it. And if you freeze framed at the time in 2011, you could read it. And it said, I wore this flag between my plates and my chest and my plate carrier on, and the numbers were insane, on like 800 raids. It saw 2,000 enemy KIA, and it saw, 12,000 captures or something. I mean, the numbers were absurd. Guys were looking at it and saying like, well, this has to be unit numbers. This has to be like total in-country numbers for his squadron and all of GWAT. And then the Spooner brothers hung their own shingle out from Delta Force to keep from killing themselves or something, Scott and Tom Spooner. And they were talking about, collectively, we want the same numbers, just hundreds, if not low thousands of raids, like massive numbers of enemy KIA. And then Relentless Strike came out, and it details what Flynn and McChrystal built, and I'm sure instantiated at Joint Special Operations Command. The first step would be, there were some questions about why the regiment had been elevated to Tier 1 funding status within Joint Special Operations Command. A lot of those questions I think are beginning to be answered in terms of the skills being shed down to the regiment as Delta Force continues to kind of escape into full-fledged one-stop shop intelligence and direct action service. But this process of shedding allows these units with a lot more time developing new skills and being at the cutting edge of things to continue to evolve into services that can do what the Expeditionary Targeting Force laid down for them. And they work in the total joint environment probably now, where the idea was you bring the Rangers in as a kind of a blocking force in these urban environments in Iraq. So maybe 3 hours out from the first raid of the night. And there'd be first raids all over a target area and all over the country. So these Rangers would get into place. They'd use some pretty advanced urban skills that were learned and shed down to them again from Tier 1 units and special mission units with the introduction of these great teachers that came from totally eclectic backgrounds, like Mark Twight, one of the great modern alpinists, came in and taught climbing techniques to special mission units in the mid-90s. And you might think, like, who cares about climbing or alpinism? The bleed down effects of having Twight around at places like Bragg when they go out to the Bob, which is like the giant something Roberts wilderness in Montana, were massive because it taught them about the value of high-tech gear, about civilian clothes. And you'd see that in the public imagery of the unit while they were doing bodyguarding, because that's all they were really doing. According to Pat McNamara, in the Balkans, they didn't get to drop the hammer on anybody. So they were doing a lot of bodyguarding. You see guys wearing like mountain hardware, and soft shells and stuff. And a soft shell in the mid to late 90s was kind of a cutting edge thing, You see the impact literally in what they were choosing to wear. They find out that climbing backpacks or alpinist rigs can carry like an 11.5 or a 10.5 inch gun instead of needing something with a folding stock. You don't have to make as many logistical trades as someone like the SAS did, or units like the SAS would have done overseas to carry an HK-53 around. And by the time of the ETF, you have this strategy in place. If you read Black Hawk Down, or you guys watched, I don't know if it's in the movie, but one of the great reformers that failed within Delta Force and then left, Paul Howe, who was so esteemed, his recognition and reputation in that community were so great, he married Charlie Beckwith's daughter. And Howe talked about at length how the Rangers just weren't ready in 93. during Operation Gothic Serpent, the Rangers were panicking in the streets. They were creating liability issues for the Delta Force operators they were there allegedly to support. Now Delta Force had to support them and kind of become field commanders and move them around and get them into position, get their head into the game. Well, by the mid-2000s, the Rangers are skilled up enough that they're kind of the opening part of the strategy. They move into position with urban climbing. The blocking forces stay away out on the streets to close down these urban area routes of escape or ingress. So enemy quick reaction forces can't respond, or valuable targets can't leave. And it starts with the snipers, climbing buildings a couple blocks out, and then using carbon fiber caving ladders and telescoping pole ladders to then transit these narrow alleys, rooftop to rooftop, for over an hour or something to get in position on, say, all four sides of the target. This might happen in a dozen different locales at the same night, and it's all being run by a single tactical operations center, probably out of the green zone. And there's hundreds of computers there, hundreds of analysts, hundreds of people watching surveillance feeds from persistent drones. SUASs probably weren't in service then, but as small as they could get, as many cameras as they could get, as many different spectral options as they could task from satellites. It's all being done at night for the huge advantage of being able to fight through third generation night vision. And then the second force is coming in by helicopter, and it's a special mission unit. If you read Matt Bissonet's book, No Easy Day, which the DoD clawed all his royalties back for because he didn't put it through review, they fly to the target building. One team enters from the top, another team enters from below, and they take it down, and then they leave immediately. Right? As soon as you prosecute the target, you kill or capture whoever's there. The interrogators are coming in right behind you. It's kind of like in the detective TV shows or cop TV shows where the detectives are coming in body armor with the SWAT team, like right behind them. They're coming in, they're working these guys. The SSE people are coming in to exploit evidence. They're doing it, on kitchen tables. The magic of broadband and whatever the military equivalent of 5G is sending all this stuff back to the TOC. And they're generating, might be generating like the third raid that assault force is going to take down that night. Because they're already back in the bird and in the trucks, and they're going to the second target. And the idea was that they could turn over evidence generated by a hit so quickly that you would be prosecuting, like I said, within a few raids, that target set the same night. And they would just do this over and over. And the losses mounted to incredible degrees. Bissonette said, without any combat experience, and this speaks to the difference between Army and Navy special mission units, that he was brought into Green Team, the selection process for development group, out of a vanilla SEAL team, a regular SEAL team. And without any combat experience, during the global war on terror, he first entered combat in like 03, 04 maybe, in Iraq, to augment Delta Force's losses. They said that it didn't take very long for Iraqi insurgent groups to figure out what you needed to do was just set up sandbags in the corner, like the middle floor in the house with a PKM, like a belt-fed machine gun, and just focus it on a fatal funnel. Now guys come back and they've been told by psychiatrists and Army psychologists, because the suicides have mounted to incredible degrees, and they cover the number of special operations suicides by averaging them out to the entire force. And we know that since the Status of Forces Agreement drawdown in 2011, and of course particularly since in Afghanistan, the total withdrawal of forces, that all of the losses incurred in the military have come from special operations units. Therefore, like, all of the suicides are coming from these units too. And these guys go out on YouTube and they talk to each other, and they leave all these little hints and little clues about how abusive and insane this merger, it's almost cybernetic, of all this technological orientation focused now on very small footprint units. The smallest footprint you can have is one man, a singleton mission. Well, now they can support that with an entire TOC and a huge network of support units, surveillance units. But these guys will talk about without knowing it, maybe, or intending to, the qualities of the type of people selected for singleton intelligence type missions. They'll talk about concepts like one-man hostage rescue, which sounds absurd and crazy. And they'll walk it back. They'll say, in training. And it all comes back to them trying to fill some hole in their life that's existed ever since they separated from the service. You'll see the most remarkable things now, like veterans of the intelligence support activity come out and talk about what it was like to be in it. And they say they do this stuff to keep from killing themselves, to form a therapy. And the massive expansion of the ranks of special mission unit members, really by probably a factor of like 10 in the last 20 years, means you just have more guys slip through the cracks. And there's less stigma now. I'm assuming maybe they're not being made persona non grata for talking about unit business outside. And now you have this ability to really understand what the pressures and the things are like. And there's an institutional quality to this. This is being created by governance. Special mission units going on presidential directed missions, really existing as a function of executive privilege or the national command authority, to tell you a lot about the expansion of the American empire's ability to prosecute shadow war. And it's disturbing, and it shows you the human cost and the real primacy as nationalists of stewardship over all of our people. You have guys that are such high achievers and great competitors that they will continue to climb the ladder in an organization, not caring what the end is, but just to be in a position. They don't even care that it's to do action guy stuff. They just want to distinguish themselves from their peers. They're great people. It's a great stock to cut anything from. There are guys that would climb over each other. If the president told them, we have to drop you from a plane like naked with no parachute on the target to kill it, the guys would climb over each other to do that. And throwing them away for what, right? And this is why so many guys are eating a J-frame at home or something. How do you live with losing maybe a dozen friends? They live together, the families live together at these places, in these compounds. How do you live with that? A lot of them can't, and they don't. And this is a direct aspect and a consequence of the mismanagement of American foreign policy. Now, libertarians or whatever will tell you that this is just the direct consequence of investing or vesting way too much power in the executive. But I think the Trump administration showed us that it's something more sinister, that the power is vested in the executive, but the responsibilities of that office are now so massive due to the global footprint of the American empire as it sits, that huge numbers of totally unelected people who really just have responsibility to a patron with enough political capital to place them precisely where he wants them. Perhaps they have this portfolio that they are kind of leading these missions around, and they are gaming the system. And it's not any different than it was 30 something years ago. If you read Michael Smith's Killer Elite about the types of people in the types of offices in the Pentagon that ensure the smooth and easy transition from a normal military to one that has a growing percentage of special operations and intelligence capabilities. But I read Robert Bayer's book, See No Evil, and he said that by the time he went through basically case officer training at the farm, that the paramilitary training they got put through was for esprit de corps, and the guys teaching it were veterans of the action era of the CIA in the 50s and 60s that were now just put out to pasture to train guys in extremist skills that would never come. He doesn't say it, but by then, the time he had matured into being a full-fledged case officer, you already had the enshrinement of those capabilities in groups like Delta Force. And then again, when you talk about a direct intelligence gathering and things like that, so much of it has been bled out to the military. The CIA's kind of ability to effect regime change was too bloody and too embarrassing. Ben Wattenberg talks about this in his neoconservative admin memoir, Fighting Words, about the establishment of the National Endowment for Democracy by the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, of which he was a founding board member, saying that the CIA was getting too sloppy and too messy. They were killing too many people. He doesn't say it, but the communists, internationally controlled by Soviet interests in the press, were able to embarrass the United States on many occasions. And so now you use diplomacy by other means through the NGO rather than warfare. Not in the Clausewitzian sense of diplomacy by other means. It's like kinetic warfare, but you engage in lending and financial practices. You have increased roles for the IMF, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. That's a major player in this stuff, and just kind of holding the carrot rather than the stick. But when the stick needs to be there, we have something for that too. And it makes you wonder, if the implication was to try and dissolve some of the capabilities of the CIA being invested in a single, very powerful and kind of dangerous institution, has just given hundreds of small footprint outfits the ability to kind of also engage this. I guess in closing, I would liken it to Section 8, the mass failure of the federal housing projects for urban blacks in the 60s and 70s. It was a failure in planning. It created the open-air drug markets. Now, this is probably tied into special operations and intelligence as well. The money for Iran-Contra came from the importation of cocaine into American ghettos. And the reason why that was such a cash cow was packaging like 10,000 blacks together in the heart of a city in these towers creates these open-air drug markets once you introduce something like crack. And the violence reached a fever pitch 30 years ago. You guys can go and look at the number of murders in a city like New York, where 25 or 2,600 murders a year. They're down, 800 maybe last year. And a few years ago, they were down to 300 something. They'd reached like a 10% nadir from this peak. And inhabitants of these towers also destroyed them. And then they were literally destroyed. Cabrini Green in Chicago lasted, 20, 30 years before it's knocked down. And then Section 8 comes in. It's a huge boon to real estate, or like developers and the fusion of developers and property owners that a lot of people have been talking about lately, the financialization, the ownership of residences. And it serves to kind of break up this core that occurs, that ghettoization, that placing like 100,000 black people in a square mile in Brownsville in New York City creates like the heart, the beating heart of murder in New York City, which is horrifying crime. But what if you break that up? What if you split that apart and you cast that all out to the suburbs in these little Section 8 parcels? And now you don't ever have more than like 2 or 3% blacks at a high school. And the violence spreads at kind of a low level, and it creates dysfunction in the communities that had no blacks before, had no tough urbanites or whatever in a political sense before. But it doesn't dissolve the problem at all. It doesn't dissolve. It just creates a broader societal rot where there was a containment before. When all this shenanigans were vested singularly in the Central Intelligence Agency, maybe it was easier to control it.